Tonight, we're diving into the incredible true story of how 13 scattered colonies defied the world's most powerful empire and gave birth to a new nation. From the sparks of rebellion in Boston to the echoing words of the Declaration of Independence, from brutal winter battles and daring midnight crossings to the final victory at Yorktown, this is the complete journey of the American Revolution. It's a story of ordinary people and extraordinary courage. A story of struggle, sacrifice, and the enduring fight for freedom. So before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. If you haven't already, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the story carry you back in time. This is the American Revolution, told in full, from beginning to end. We hope it helps you learn, while you sleep. Long before the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the roots of revolution were already spreading through the American colonies. The path to independence was not sudden. It was slow, shaped by decades of tension, transformation, and the growing divide between a rising colonial identity and an empire an ocean away. It began in 1607, when English settlers founded Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. Over the next century and a half, more colonies sprang up along the Atlantic coast, Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and others. By the early 1700s, 13 colonies had been established, each with its own economy, culture, and system of local governance. Despite differences, the colonies shared one thing: they were subjects of the British Crown. Britain saw the colonies as valuable assets, sources of raw materials like tobacco, cotton, and timber, and as markets for British goods. But early on, British control was relatively light. This era, often called salutary neglect, allowed the colonies to develop their own political and economic systems with little interference. Many colonists began to see themselves not just as British subjects, but as something new, a people shaped by the frontier, by self-reliance, and by growing prosperity. They built local legislatures, printed newspapers, and formed town councils. Ideas of representative government and individual rights, inspired by thinkers like John Locke, were spreading. Then came a turning point: the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, known globally as the 7 Years' War. This massive conflict pitted Britain and its American colonies against France and its Native American allies. It was a brutal struggle for dominance in North America. When the war ended in British victory, it redrew the map. France ceded most of its territory on the continent. Britain now controlled vast new lands, stretching to the Mississippi River. But victory came at a steep cost. The war had drained the British treasury. The national debt had nearly doubled. As Britain looked to recover, it turned to the colonies, not only as a source of wealth, but as obligated partners in the empire. The British government believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense and the costs of managing the expanded territory. To the colonists, however, this shift felt like betrayal. In 1763, the British issued the Proclamation Line, forbidding colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. The goal was to avoid further conflict with Native Americans, but to many settlers, it was an insult. They had fought, and died, for that land during the war. Then came the Sugar Act of 1764, followed by the Stamp Act in 1765, taxes imposed directly on the colonies to raise revenue. For the first time, the British Parliament was taxing colonists without their consent. The colonists cried out with a phrase that would echo through history: "No taxation without representation." Protests erupted. Newspapers and pamphlets blasted the new laws. Merchants organized boycotts. In cities like Boston, resistance turned fiery and emotional. The Sons of Liberty, a secret organization, was formed to oppose British policies through direct action, sometimes through violence. The British repealed the Stamp Act, but the damage was done. A new pattern had begun. Parliament would pass taxes or regulations, the colonies would resist, and tensions would grow. Over the next few years, this cycle would intensify, pushing the colonies further from compromise and closer to revolution. What had begun as distant murmurs of discontent was becoming a unified voice of resistance. The colonies, once proud members of the British Empire, were starting to imagine something unthinkable, a future without the crown. The American Revolution had not yet begun. But its foundation had been laid, in ideas, in blood, and in the growing courage to resist. After the French and Indian War, Britain's desire to tighten control over its American colonies turned a once loyal population into a restless and increasingly rebellious one. Between 1764 and 1773, a series of political missteps, economic grievances, and violent confrontations would fan the flames of dissent, transforming frustration into open defiance. It began with the Sugar Act of 1764, which lowered the tax on imported molasses but strengthened enforcement against smuggling. For colonial merchants, it wasn't the rate that stung, it was the principle. The British were asserting new control over trade and revenue, without colonial input. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. Unlike earlier tariffs, this was a direct tax on goods made and used within the colonies. It struck at the heart of daily life and provoked immediate outrage. Lawyers, printers, and merchants led the charge in protest. Across the colonies, the cry of "No taxation without representation" grew louder. The colonists argued that they could only be taxed by their own elected assemblies, not by a distant parliament in which they had no voice. Britain disagreed. Parliament claimed virtual representation, insisting that it acted in the interest of all British subjects, whether they voted or not. Colonists weren't convinced. In Boston, New York, and other cities, protests turned to riots. Effigies of British tax collectors were hung and burned. Offices were ransacked. The Sons of Liberty, a group of radicals led by men like Samuel Adams, organized demonstrations and intimidation campaigns. In response to the outcry, Britain repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but quickly replaced it with the Declaratory Act, reaffirming its right to legislate for the colonies. In all cases whatsoever. The conflict wasn't over, it was only evolving. In 1767, the British Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, placing new duties on glass, paint, lead, paper, and tea. These were import taxes, but the colonists saw them as yet another attempt to extract revenue without consent. The colonies responded with widespread boycotts of British goods. Women played a key role during this period, forming groups like the Daughters of Liberty, who made homespun cloth and encouraged others to reject British imports. Colonial unity was growing, not just in protest, but in principle. Boston became the epicenter of unrest. British troops were stationed in the city in 1768 to enforce order, but their presence only made things worse. Tensions exploded on March 5, 1770, when a confrontation between soldiers and civilians turned deadly. 5 colonists were killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The event was quickly seized upon by Patriot leaders. Paul Revere's engraving, showing British troops firing into an unarmed crowd, was widely distributed and inflamed public opinion. Though the soldiers involved were later acquitted in court, the damage to Britain's reputation was done. For a time, tensions cooled. Britain repealed most of the Townshend duties, keeping only the tax on tea. But even this small remnant carried a larger message. Britain would not relinquish its right to tax the colonies. Then, in 1773, came the spark that would ignite the fuse. The Tea Act granted the struggling British East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea directly to the colonies, effectively creating a monopoly. Though the tax remained, the tea was cheaper. But the colonists saw it for what it was, a political trap. If they bought the tea, they would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them. In December 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. It was bold, illegal, and unforgettable. The Boston Tea Party had sent a message across the Atlantic. The time for debate was ending. The storm of revolution was drawing near. The Boston Tea Party had been a dramatic statement, a direct challenge to British authority. But if the colonists expected a concession or negotiation, they were mistaken. Instead, Britain responded with swift and severe punishment. In early 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws aimed squarely at Massachusetts. The British called them the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they were known by another name, the Intolerable Acts. The first and most immediate was the Boston Port Act. It closed the harbor until the East India Company was repaid for the destroyed tea. Boston, a bustling center of commerce, was economically strangled. Trade halted. Jobs vanished. British warships patrolled the harbor like a blockade. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which revoked the colony's charter and placed the government directly under royal control. Town meetings were restricted. Local elections were severely limited. The governor, now appointed by the crown, had broad powers. This was more than punishment. It was a direct assault on self-governance. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain, where they would likely escape consequences. To the colonists, it seemed like British officials were being placed above the law. Finally, the Quartering Act required colonists to house and feed British soldiers, even in their private homes, if necessary. It was a bitter reminder of the growing military presence in their daily lives. These laws were intended to isolate Massachusetts and crush the spirit of resistance. But they had the opposite effect. Across the colonies, sympathy for Boston surged. Towns sent food, money, and supplies to help those affected by the port closure. What had once been local unrest was quickly becoming a continental cause. For the first time, the colonies began to act as one. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. This unprecedented meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. Only Georgia, still heavily reliant on British support against Native American attacks, abstained from attending. The delegates were not radicals seeking independence, at least not yet. Many still hoped for reconciliation with the crown. But they were united in their opposition to the intolerable acts and determined to defend their rights. Among the delegates were men who would soon become household names: George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, among others. Some favored negotiation. Others believed more forceful resistance might be needed. But all agreed that action was necessary. The Congress drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, affirming their loyalty to King George III but rejecting Parliament's authority to tax them without consent. They also organized a boycott of British goods and established local enforcement committees. The hope was that economic pressure would force Britain to back down. At the same time, colonial militias began drilling and stockpiling weapons. Across Massachusetts and other colonies, Minutemen, volunteers who could be ready to fight at a moment's notice, were formed. British generals took note. One, General Thomas Gage, was appointed military governor of Massachusetts. He requested reinforcements and prepared for possible armed resistance. While political leaders debated in Philadelphia, a sense of inevitability began to spread. The colonies were preparing for all outcomes, including war. Back in Britain, the response to the Continental Congress was dismissive. Parliament rejected the colonists' petitions and declared Massachusetts to be in open rebellion. The king, far from conciliatory, prepared to send more troops. The lines were hardening. Dialogue was giving way to defiance. By the end of 1774, both sides were digging in, unwilling to yield, and unknowingly approaching the point of no return. The fuse had been lit. All that remained was the spark. By the spring of 1775, the American colonies were a powder keg. British troops garrisoned in Boston watched nervously as colonial militias armed themselves, trained in open fields, and prepared for conflict. Tensions had escalated for over a decade, but now, war felt imminent. The question was no longer if, but when and where. In Massachusetts, the heart of resistance, General Thomas Gage, now military governor, was under pressure to suppress the growing rebellion. Reports reached him that colonists were stockpiling weapons and ammunition in Concord, a small town just outside Boston. Among the leaders of the resistance were Samuel Adams and John Hancock, rumored to be hiding nearby in Lexington. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched about 700 British troops under Colonel Francis Smith to march to Concord. Their orders: seize and destroy the colonial military supplies and arrest Adams and Hancock if possible. It was meant to be a swift, secretive operation. But the colonists were watching. That night, a network of riders set out across the countryside to warn of the British approach. Among them was Paul Revere, who rode from Boston shouting, "The British are coming!" Though that exact phrase is debated, the meaning was clear: danger was on the way. In Lexington, around 70 Minutemen gathered on the village green in the early morning hours of April 19th. They were vastly outnumbered and not expecting to fight. Their goal was to show defiance, not provoke a battle. Just as the sun began to rise, British troops arrived. What happened next remains a mystery. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. But within seconds, volleys erupted. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, and the rest had scattered. The Battle of Lexington had begun the American Revolution with a single gunshot, later immortalized as the shot heard round the world. The British troops then continued to Concord, where they found and destroyed some supplies. But by now, hundreds of militiamen from surrounding towns had mobilized. At the North Bridge, they confronted the British in force. This time, the Americans fired with intent. In the exchange, several British soldiers were killed, and the rest began a long, harrowing retreat back to Boston. That retreat turned into a running battle. Along the 18-mile road from Concord to Boston, the British faced a constant barrage. Colonial militias fired from behind stone walls, trees, and fences. Snipers picked off officers. By the time the Redcoats reached the city, they had suffered over 250 casualties. Word spread like wildfire. The colonies were no longer just resisting, they were fighting. The battles at Lexington and Concord marked the official outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Within days, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston, trapping the British inside the city. This impromptu army, made up of farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, would soon become the Continental Army. The British had underestimated the colonists. What they thought would be a quick crackdown had instead sparked a full-blown conflict. And across the colonies, the mood was changing. Men volunteered to fight. Supplies were gathered. Newspapers declared a new chapter in American history had begun. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Among its first acts was the creation of the Continental Army, with George Washington of Virginia named Commander-in-Chief. A former officer in the French and Indian War, Washington was chosen for his experience, leadership, and regional balance, a Southern man to lead a largely Northern conflict. Though war had begun, independence was not yet the declared goal. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. But the road ahead was already being paved, with blood, courage, and the determination to defend liberty. The revolution was no longer a dream. It had become a reality, with no turning back. Following the battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonies found themselves at war, not by declaration, but by action. Throughout the spring of 1775, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston, where British troops, under General Thomas Gage, were effectively under siege. In May, the Second Continental Congress reconvened in Philadelphia to manage the growing crisis. Among its early acts was the formation of the Continental Army, a unified military force representing all 13 colonies. To lead it, the delegates unanimously appointed George Washington, a tall, commanding Virginian with military experience and a reputation for resolve. Washington accepted, knowing the task ahead would be immense. Back in Massachusetts, tensions mounted. The colonial forces were eager but undisciplined, an army in name only. They lacked uniforms, consistent training, and even basic supplies. Still, their numbers and spirit presented a real threat to British control. In June 1775, British commanders decided to break the siege. Their goal was to take the Charlestown Peninsula, which included 2 key hills, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, that overlooked Boston Harbor. Seizing those heights would give the British strategic control. The colonists got wind of the plan. On the night of June 16th, colonial forces led by Colonel William Prescott quietly moved on to Breed's Hill and built fortifications. When the sun rose, British ships in the harbor saw what had happened. The colonists had entrenched themselves within cannon range of the city. On June 17th, the British launched a full frontal assault. Wearing bright red coats under the scorching sun, British soldiers advanced up the hill in tight formation. The Americans, low on ammunition, were ordered not to fire until they could see the whites of their enemies' eyes. When they did, the volleys were devastating. The first and second British charges were repelled with heavy losses. But on the third attempt, the British finally broke through, not due to superior force, but because the defenders ran out of ammunition. The colonists retreated in good order, and the British technically won the Battle of Bunker Hill. Yet the cost was enormous, over 1,000 British casualties, including many officers. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The colonial losses were fewer, around 400, but the psychological impact was enormous. The battle proved that colonial militiamen could stand and fight against the world's most powerful army. It gave the revolutionaries confidence, and warned the British that the war ahead would not be easily won. Meanwhile, Washington arrived in Cambridge in early July 1775 to take command of the new Continental Army. What he found was a ragtag force, under-equipped, poorly disciplined, and barely resembling a functioning military. Washington immediately began the hard work of instilling order, issuing drills, organizing supplies, and building fortifications. Throughout late 1775 and early 1776, the siege of Boston continued. Washington faced the challenge: how to expel the British without heavy artillery. That problem was solved thanks to a remarkable feat by Colonel Henry Knox, who led a daring winter expedition to bring captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, hauling 60 tons of artillery over frozen rivers and snowy mountains. By March 1776, Washington placed these cannons on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. With the city now indefensible, the British had no choice. On March 17th, they evacuated Boston, sailing to Nova Scotia, taking Loyalist families with them. The colonists had won a major victory, not just tactically, but symbolically. Boston, the birthplace of the rebellion, had been liberated. But the war was far from over. The British had not given up. In fact, they were preparing to return, with a much larger force. And in Philadelphia, ideas that once seemed unthinkable were now becoming inevitable. Talk of independence was no longer a whisper. It was becoming a roar. By early 1776, the colonies had been at war with Britain for nearly a year, but the goal was still unclear. Many colonists continued to hope for reconciliation with King George III. They envisioned reform, not rebellion. But as battles dragged on and British troops prepared for new campaigns, the idea of independence gained momentum. The spark that helped ignite that idea came not from a general or politician, but from a writer. In January 1776, a pamphlet titled Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, began circulating throughout the colonies. In clear, powerful language, Paine made the case for full independence. He argued that it was absurd for a vast continent to be ruled by a small island across the ocean. Monarchies, he claimed, were unnatural and corrupt. The time had come to break free. There is something absurd, he wrote, in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Common Sense sold more than 100,000 copies in just a few months, an astonishing number for the time. Its impact was immediate and widespread. In taverns, churches, and town halls, people began to speak openly of forming a new nation. By the spring of 1776, the momentum was undeniable. The Second Continental Congress, still meeting in Philadelphia, took the first step by instructing colonies to form new governments independent of British rule. One by one, colonial assemblies voiced their support for separation. On June 7, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia formally introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The debate was fierce. Some delegates feared it was too soon, that the colonies were not yet ready to stand alone. Others, like John Adams, believed delay was dangerous. A committee was formed to draft a formal declaration. Among its members, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson, a young delegate from Virginia, was chosen to write the first draft. Over the next few weeks, Jefferson penned what would become one of the most iconic documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. Drawing on Enlightenment ideals and colonial grievances, Jefferson outlined a simple, radical idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to alter or abolish any government that becomes destructive to their rights. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted in favor of Lee's resolution for independence. 2 days later, on July 4, they officially adopted Jefferson's declaration. It was bold. It was dangerous. And it was revolutionary. The opening words rang like a bell. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." With the stroke of a pen, 13 colonies declared themselves free and independent states, severing their ties to the British Crown. News of the declaration spread quickly. In Philadelphia, church bells rang out. Crowds gathered to cheer. In New York, where a large British fleet loomed offshore, soldiers pulled down a statue of King George III and melted it into bullets. But while the colonies had declared independence, Britain had no intention of letting them go. That summer, General William Howe arrived in New York with the largest British expeditionary force ever assembled, over 30,000 troops, including thousands of Hessian mercenaries from Germany. Washington, now leading the Continental Army, braced for battle. The war was about to enter its most intense and dangerous phase. A nation had been born in words. Now, it would have to be defended in blood. The Declaration of Independence had been signed, printed, and read aloud in town squares across the colonies. But even as Americans celebrated their newfound status, a storm was brewing just off the coast of New York. In the summer of 1776, the British launched a full-scale invasion. General William Howe, accompanied by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, brought more than 30,000 troops, British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, and naval power to match. Their goal was clear: crush the rebellion swiftly and decisively. George Washington, with only 19,000 men, many poorly trained and ill-equipped, prepared to defend New York City. The fighting began in August on Long Island, in what became known as the Battle of Brooklyn, the largest battle of the entire war. It was a disaster for the Americans. Howe outflanked Washington's position, forcing a chaotic retreat. Only a daring nighttime evacuation across the East River, aided by fog and silence, saved Washington's army from complete destruction. Over the next few months, Washington's forces suffered a series of defeats. The British captured New York City, then White Plains, and later Fort Washington. The Continental Army was driven across New Jersey, losing men, morale, and supplies at every step. Soldiers deserted. Enlistments expired. Civilians began to doubt the cause. By December 1776, Washington had fewer than 5,000 men. Many were barefoot, hungry, and discouraged. The revolution appeared to be collapsing. And yet, in these darkest hours, Washington refused to surrender. He understood that the revolution's survival didn't depend solely on victories, but on persistence. So, with winter approaching and enlistments set to expire, he devised a bold plan, not to retreat, but to attack. Across the Delaware River, in Trenton, New Jersey, a garrison of about 1,400 Hessian soldiers celebrated Christmas, unaware of the coming assault. Washington aimed to surprise them. On the night of December 25, 1776, amid snow, sleet, and freezing winds, Washington led 2,400 soldiers across the ice-choked Delaware. It was a perilous journey. Men marched with frozen feet. Horses collapsed. 2 detachments failed to cross entirely. But by dawn, Washington and his main force had reached the other side. The Battle of Trenton began early on December 26th. The Hessians, caught off guard and disorganized, were quickly overwhelmed. In less than 2 hours, nearly 900 were captured. American losses were minimal. It was a stunning victory. Washington didn't stop there. A week later, he struck again at Princeton, defeating a British rear guard. These twin victories electrified the colonies. Newspapers spread the news. Recruitment surged. Soldiers re-enlisted. Confidence was restored. The legend of Washington as a leader who could defy odds and inspire hope was born during those bitter winter days. But the larger war still loomed. The British controlled New York. Loyalist support remained strong in some areas. And another campaign was already taking shape in the north. Still, the victories at Trenton and Princeton changed the tone of the war. They proved that the British could be beaten, that the Continental Army, despite its hardships, could strike with boldness and precision. It also altered British strategy. Rather than chasing Washington through the countryside, they would now look to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, hoping to divide and conquer. But the Americans had shown something powerful: resolve. In the cold of winter, with everything to lose, they had fought back. The revolution had not been extinguished. It had been reignited, in icy waters, in surprise attacks, and in the unbreakable will to endure. As the war continued into 1777, the British command sought to deliver a decisive blow. Their new strategy was to divide and conquer, separate New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the middle and southern colonies. If the Americans could be split, British leaders believed, the revolution would crumble from within. The plan was ambitious. General John Burgoyne, a British officer known for his flair and confidence, would march south from Canada through the Hudson Valley, capturing Albany, New York. Simultaneously, General Howe, based in New York City, was expected to move north and link up with Burgoyne. Together, they would cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. But things did not go as planned. Burgoyne began his march in June 1777 with a large, slow-moving army, burdened by wagons, cannons, and a long supply line. The terrain was brutal. Dense forests, muddy trails, and narrow rivers slowed his advance. American forces, led by commanders like Philip Schuyler and Horatio Gates, used guerrilla tactics to harass and delay the British. Local militias swarmed from surrounding towns. Trees were felled to block roads. Supply lines were cut. Burgoyne's Native American allies, once a powerful asset, began to drift away. Worse, General Howe, instead of moving north to support Burgoyne, diverted his army south to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital. Burgoyne was alone. The turning point came in October 1777, near the small town of Saratoga. American forces, bolstered by sharpshooters and reinforcements, dug in. Among the key leaders was Benedict Arnold, a daring and aggressive commander who defied orders and led a bold charge during the Battle of Bemis Heights. The attack broke through British lines, forcing Burgoyne to retreat. Trapped by American forces and with no reinforcements in sight, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, over 6,000 men, on October 17, 1777. The Battle of Saratoga was a watershed moment in the American Revolution. For the first time, an entire British army had been defeated and captured in the field. It gave the revolution international credibility, and the world took notice. In France, the victory at Saratoga changed everything. For years, France had watched the conflict with interest. Still bitter from its loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War, France was eager to see its old rival weakened. But they were reluctant to support a cause that seemed doomed to fail. Saratoga proved that the Americans could fight, and win. In February 1778, France formally entered the war on the side of the United States. The Treaty of Alliance made France a full military partner. French money, weapons, and most importantly, a powerful navy would now support the revolution. Spain and the Dutch Republic would later join the conflict, turning what began as a colonial rebellion into a global war. Back in America, the winter of 1777 to 1778 was brutal. Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, endured months of freezing temperatures, starvation, and disease. Over 2,000 men died. But it was also a season of transformation. At Valley Forge, a Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived to help train the Continental Army. He introduced discipline, drills, and structure, turning the ragged volunteers into a more professional fighting force. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Congress worked to stabilize the government, print currency, and secure more foreign aid. Though strained, the revolutionary effort was still alive. The year 1778 began with new hope. France's entry had changed the game. The Continental Army was stronger. The spirit of independence, though tested, was burning brighter than ever. The revolution was no longer just America's fight. It had become a struggle for freedom on the world stage. By 1778, the nature of the American Revolution was changing. With France now formally allied to the American cause, the war had expanded onto the global stage. British commanders shifted their focus from the north, where campaigns had stalled, to the southern colonies, where they believed loyalist support was stronger and victory more achievable. The southern strategy began in earnest in 1778, when British forces captured Savannah, Georgia. By 1780, they took Charleston, South Carolina, in one of the worst defeats of the war for the Americans. Over 5,000 troops were captured. The British now controlled key ports and planned to move inland, rallying loyalists and crushing rebel forces piecemeal. But the war in the South would not be as straightforward as the British hoped. What unfolded was a brutal campaign of guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and a deeply personal civil war between patriots and loyalists. The countryside was engulfed in violence. Farms were burned, families torn apart, and neighbors turned into enemies. One of the most effective American leaders in the South was Francis Marion, nicknamed the Swamp Fox. Using small, mobile units, Marion launched surprise attacks on British supply lines, patrols, and outposts, then vanished into the swamps of South Carolina. His tactics frustrated the British and inspired local resistance. Meanwhile, a new commander took charge of American forces in the South, General Nathanael Greene, appointed by Washington. Greene understood that direct confrontation would be disastrous against superior British numbers. Instead, he waged a campaign of strategic retreats, drawing the British deeper into hostile territory. In 1781, Greene's strategy paid off at the Battle of Cowpens, where General Daniel Morgan decisively defeated British commander Banastre Tarleton. At Guilford Courthouse, though technically a British victory, General Cornwallis's army suffered heavy losses. The cost of each victory was weakening British momentum. Cornwallis, frustrated and running low on supplies, moved north into Virginia, hoping to regroup and link up with British forces there. He chose Yorktown, a small coastal town along the Chesapeake Bay, as his base of operations. It would prove to be a fatal mistake. By the fall of 1781, Washington saw an opportunity. Working closely with French General Rochambeau, he devised a plan to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. While the British believed Washington might attack New York, the Americans and French marched south in secret. At the same time, the French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, sailed into the Chesapeake and blocked British ships from reaching Cornwallis by sea. Cut off from escape and reinforcements, Cornwallis was surrounded. On September 28, 1781, American and French forces, over 16,000 strong, began the siege of Yorktown. For nearly 3 weeks, they bombarded British positions with heavy artillery, dug siege lines, and slowly closed in. On October 14, American troops, led in part by Alexander Hamilton, stormed key British fortifications. Within days, it was clear Cornwallis had no way out. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of over 7,000 men. The scene was unforgettable. As the British troops marched out to lay down their arms, a band is said to have played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." It was the symbolic end of the Revolutionary War. Though scattered fighting continued, Yorktown broke British political will. In London, Parliament turned against the war. Peace negotiations began shortly after. The war had begun with skirmishes in the Massachusetts countryside. It had spanned oceans, drawn in empires, and transformed farmers into fighters, and colonies into a nation. Now, All that remained was to secure peace, and ensure the new republic could stand. With the surrender of British General Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781, the American Revolution had reached its dramatic military climax. But while cannons fell silent in Virginia, the war was not officially over. Months of diplomacy, negotiation, and uncertainty still lay ahead before peace could be secured. In London, the defeat at Yorktown shattered the British government's confidence. Prime Minister Lord North reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over!" when he heard the news. Support for the war crumbled in Parliament. By early 1782, Lord North's government resigned, and a new, more peace-minded ministry took power. Across the Atlantic, the Second Continental Congress, now operating as a de facto government, appointed a delegation to negotiate peace. Leading the team were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, a trio of experienced, shrewd diplomats. The talks took place in Paris, with the French, Spanish, and Dutch also involved. France and Spain had entered the war to weaken Britain, but they had their own interests in the negotiations. The Americans, however, were determined to secure terms that would ensure their sovereignty, security, and future prosperity. Despite French alliances, the American delegates conducted separate negotiations with the British, wary that their European partners might trade away American interests for their own gains. It was a risky move, but it worked. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Its terms were astonishing. Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation's borders extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from Canada in the north to Spanish Florida in the south. It was an immense territory, far larger than the 13 original colonies. Britain also agreed to withdraw its troops and return American property. In turn, Congress promised to recommend that Loyalist property confiscated during the war be returned and that debts owed to British creditors be honored. The treaty was ratified by Congress on January 14, 1784, marking the official end of the Revolutionary War. After 8 years of struggle, the American colonies had secured their freedom, not through compromise or submission, but through perseverance, resilience, and unity. In November 1783, the last British soldiers left New York City, and George Washington entered triumphantly. The city had been under British control for most of the war. Now, it symbolized the dawn of a new era. A few weeks later, on December 23, Washington appeared before Congress in Annapolis, Maryland, to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief. In an emotional address, he expressed gratitude, humility, and a desire to return to private life. He handed back power willingly, an act that stunned the world. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theater of action." The war was over, but the experiment had just begun. The United States faced enormous challenges. There was no central government strong enough to bind the states together. The Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, proved weak and ineffective. Economic turmoil and political divisions threatened to undo what had been won. But the Revolution's legacy endured. It had inspired a belief in liberty, self-governance, and the power of the people. It had challenged the idea that kings ruled by divine right. And it had sent a message across the world: freedom could be fought for and achieved. In the years that followed, the United States would draft a constitution, elect its first president, and begin its long, complicated journey as a republic. The revolution was not perfect. Slavery remained. Women had few rights. Native nations were displaced. But the ideals planted during the struggle would grow, evolve, and continue to shape history. From muskets in Massachusetts to diplomacy in Paris, from common farmers to statesmen, the American Revolution was not just the birth of a nation, it was the birth of an idea that would echo through centuries to come.